From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Trump imposes broad 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum imports to the United States, as the Labor Department says that the Consumer Price Index inflation gauge went up again, hitting 3% year over year. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We're joined today by my colleagues, columnist Alicia Finley and editorial board member Mene Ukwe-Barua. President Trump called off his across-the-board tariffs on Canada and Mexico recently, at least for 30 days. But on Monday, he doubled down on the metals tariffs that he imposed during his first term. Those were 25% tariffs on steel and 10% on aluminum. Now he's putting 25% on both metals, and in a very across-the-board way. The fact sheet from the White House, for example, points out that there had been exemptions given to such nefarious countries as Australia, Canada, Japan, South Korea, the European Union, and the United Kingdom, which, in the words of the White House fact sheet, created loopholes that were exploited to undermine the purposes of those exemptions. Alicia, what's your read of the effect that this could have on the economy, and maybe a reminder of how those first-term Trump metals tariffs worked in the real world?
So what happened in 2018, as you explained, is they imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum, and this was really at the behest of the steel and aluminum lobbies, who were complaining that they had excess capacity because foreign imports were flooding the market. And by excess capacity, I mean that there was manufacturing plants weren't actually operating at the levels that they could. In March 2018, when he actually announced the tariffs, it took a few months before he actually imposed them after that. They were operating at about 74%. And the point of the tariffs was supposedly to increase the manufacturing capacity to about 80%. But what ended up happening is that the steel and aluminum tariffs actually ended up raising the prices for domestic manufacturers, including a lot of steel and what are called secondary steel and aluminum manufacturers, which kind of utilize the raw production, which is primarily based actually outside of the U.S. And there are many more jobs involved in secondary steel and aluminum manufacturing, and then fabricated metals, which is actually a separate category. And because of that, a lot of companies ended up laying off workers. And so while you saw an immediate boost in employment in manufacturing in the steel and aluminum industries after the tariffs took effect, which I would actually argue had more to do with an increase in capital investment from his tax reform and deregulation, ultimately you actually then saw a decline in employment and many fewer workers employed in manufacturing overall. You also saw, as I mentioned, an immediate price increases, but eventually actually prices ended up falling because there was a reduced demand. So it was a bit of a boomerang effect on steel and aluminum manufacturers, and hence why they are now complaining again that the tariffs weren't enough, in part because they claimed that there were a number of exemptions, but I'm not sure that that would have much affected the global supply and global prices, and that ergo that the administration needs to tighten them up to protect them and to protect domestic jobs.
But the result of this is, I think, uncertainty at the very least for businesses. Another line that jumps out for me from this White House fact sheet is that they are expanding tariffs to include key downstream products. And the way I read that is that if you put a tariff on, let's say, steel coming into the United States, and that disadvantages somebody who is a buyer of steel and a manufacturer of something like nails, and they complain, one strategy to deal with that is to give them an exemption from the tariff. The other strategy is to expand tariffs to downstream products and put tariffs on nails that might be imported to the United States to protect the nail manufacturer from the damage that has been created to its business by the steel tariff. It seems to me, Mene, there's all sorts of companies, CEOs this week that are probably now trying to figure out how they are going to reorganize their supply chains. A couple examples from the press, the CEO of Coca-Cola saying on an earnings call, if one package suffers some increase in input costs, we continue to have other packaging offerings that will allow us to compete in the affordability space. If aluminum cans become more expensive, we can put more emphasis on PET bottles, meaning plastic bottles. So a rejiggering there potentially of the soda supply chain. Forward, another example of a CEO at a conference, he's saying so far what we're seeing is a lot of cost costs and a lot of chaos. He is also warning about the threatened tariffs on Mexico and Canada, saying that that would blow a hole in the U.S. industry that we've never seen. Frankly, it gives free rein to South Korean and Japanese and European companies that are bringing 1.5 to 2 million vehicles into the U.S. that wouldn't be subject to those Mexican and Canadian tariffs, unquote. So, Monet, those are two high-profile examples, high-profile companies, but it is the 100 companies that are making nails and less high-profile products that are going to get less attention, but are in the same sort of pickle.
Exactly. I think you just described the core difficulty of imposing tariffs on a commodity good like steel, in that there are so many more consumers, intermediate consumers of that commodity than there are producers of it. Obviously, the steel industry is extremely influential. It's fairly large, and it is politically important. You have Trump himself, J.D. Vance, and a lot of people who represent constituencies where steel is produced in the United States, places like Ohio, Pennsylvania, who want to make a show of protecting domestic steel industry and are going to always push in that direction. But for every steel producer, you have many, many more companies that need to consume steel and are going to be hit hard by any price increase that comes from protecting domestic steel at the expense of imports. And so I think we're about to see the march of the exemptions, you could call it, as so many companies start to put their hands up and say that they deserve a carve out. President Trump, for now, says that he has no interest in doing that. But probably as we go on and the pain starts to occur for auto manufacturers, for can manufacturers, for all types of different machines that incorporate steel into their production process, we're going to see some of the carve-outs start to occur. I think one irony that's worth pointing out here is that all of the people who say that they're interested in promoting the production of domestic steel also tended to oppose the Nippon Steel bid to purchase U.S. steel, which would have increased domestic production pretty significantly. The idea was, as Alicia pointed out, that there's an actual lack of utilizing the capacity for production that we have among American steel manufacturers as it is. They were only using something like 70% of their full capacity. And part of that is demand, but part of it is just efficiency. A lot of American facilities are older. They're run fairly inefficient way. Obviously, they also have to negotiate with their unions when they want to make any kind of change. And Nippon Steel, a Japanese company, wanted to come in and invest in newer facilities and upgrades, and that would have allowed American steel to be produced more efficiently. So it would have helped consumers of steel while also helping the American steel industry. But of course, President Biden blocked that deal and President Trump opposed it too. And so they claim to favor a strong domestic steel industry, but they've relied on the bludgeon of tariffs instead of actually allowing smart deals that would allow the industry to progress in a way that's good for consumers and producers alike.
Hang tight. We'll be right back. Welcome back.
Aside from that economic pain is the question of uncertainty, Alicia, because business investment decisions are in some sense bets about the future of the company, the future of the economy. Notable, the Journal in its editorial today is citing some data from the National Federation of Independent Business, NFIB. It has a small business uncertainty index. And that hit a 5-year peak right before the 2024 election at a value of 110. And then after the election, it dropped somewhat, as you would think. You have a winning candidate. So the policy uncertainty of not knowing who's going to be the next president of the United States is being alleviated. But then in January, it jumped again back from 86, where it was in December, to 100. So it is now again at a high, excluding the period right before the 2024 election in the past 5 years. Alicia, what do you make of that as a matter of a drag on the economy and economic growth if small businesses are not sure what the economy is going to look like, are not sure how much tariffs are going to be a weight, are not sure if tariffs on Mexico and Canada are coming at the end of this 30-day delay or not?
Right. And to all your points, I think that's all correct. Small business uncertainty, it's really an important measure sure because big businesses can actually handle kind of compliance, regulatory burdens, higher costs, and uncertainty a lot better than small businesses. And they all have actually financial arrangements and hedges on all of that, derivatives that they can manage changes in steel costs and all of that. Small businesses, much less so at least. And so I think that the spike in small business uncertainty reflects, one, the tariffs. Trump's coming in now threatening. Initially during the campaign, he said 10% across the board and maybe 60% on China, or maybe even 20% across the board. It was not clear where he actually stood. And then he came into office and now immediately threatened Canada and Mexico with 25% across the board tariffs. He walked that back some. But he's continuing to threaten Europe, and now with reciprocal tariffs, and then tariffs on particular goods. And so nobody really knows what he's going to impose tariffs on. And that really suppresses investment. If you don't know what's going to happen, how the government is going to pose new burdens on your business, which was, by the way, a big problem under the Biden administration with its regulatory onslaught and threats of higher taxes, then it's very difficult to invest. And that's really a concern for Trump, is because economic growth, it was still fairly strong during the fourth quarter, but it's been slowing, and business investment has actually been quite anemic. And so if you want to keep the economy and economic growth going, you need more business investment, especially small businesses who actually employ the vast majority of Americans. So this uncertainty could dent hiring, and you may have seen that actually in the last jobs report, where there was only 143,000 new jobs created in January, which was lower than many expected after really a big rebound in job creation in November and December. And I would also point out one other thing that could be creating uncertainty for business is just the threats of the immigration crackdown. Nobody really knows how far he's going to go. Trump has been saying in some comments, we're only going to focus on the criminals. And that obviously wouldn't concern employers. But once you start rounding up and going to workplaces, meatpacking houses, or just, restaurants, that could really dent the workforce. So I think there are a lot of things that have small businesses on tenterhooks. And I think that is going to be to the detriment of the president's own economic growth agenda.
One potential clue to Trump's thinking is a Truth Social post that he put out this morning at about 8 a.m. It says interest rates should be lowered, something which would go hand in hand with upcoming tariffs. Let's rock and roll America. So potentially his thought there is if interest rates go down, the economy gets a little bit of boost from that. That might offset some of this uncertainty, this economic pain from the tariffs. But Monet, that was hours, I think, before the Labor Department then released the Consumer Price Index report for January, showing that inflation year over year in January was up 3%. That is an increase from the figure of 2.9% in December. And it gets even better than that if you look at the figure for core inflation. And as a reminder, core inflation excludes food and energy because those categories tend to be volatile. One example being egg prices. Egg prices, according to the Journal's report, were up 15% from December, but that seems to have to do with bird flu more than any sort of general economic trend. So if you take out those volatile food and energy categories, core inflation year over year is up 3.3%. And so, Monet, that is not the message that I think President Trump was hoping for if he wants these interest rates to be going down.
Yeah, Trump is an easy money man at all times. No matter what the economic data shows, he always leans in the direction, at least when he's in office. I don't know whether this was the case when President Biden was, but he always wants the Fed to cut rates. And he obviously believes that he can use the bully pulpit either to persuade the Fed to move in that direction, or at least to blame them if they choose not to. And so it makes sense that he would say some of the pain from the tariffs that he imposes is going to be offset by rate cuts, which, as you said, could give a little bit of a jolt to the economy. But he isn't actually looking at the inflation trend, and he isn't prepared to endure a longer period of higher rates if inflation keeps going in the direction that it is. That's an argument that his economic advisors are going to have to make to him. You can't bet anymore that we're going to see several rate cuts in this year, as people would have predicted a few months ago before President Trump took office. And insofar as he's on the fence about keeping some of his tariffs in place, they can point to that stickiness of inflation and higher interest rates as one more reason for him to say, hey, I'm going to actually take this off and, pretend to have cut a deal with one of the countries that was affected with them as an excuse for getting rid of the tariffs, because he knows that there isn't going to be anything that's going to cushion the blow that they'll deal to businesses large and small and consumers also.